to talk about is the legacy of Frank Herbert and his 50 years of Dune, because it's a very nice anniversary celebration. Dune was the biggest science fiction book ever. Dune was the best science fiction book ever. And I was 12 years old, so I got around to actually reading Dune. I went into, some of you may remember this, a little store in a big shopping mall called B. Dalton Bookseller. And I found a paperback which had a bright orange spine. I had to buy this because I was 12 years old and it had a giant sandworm monster on the cover of it. So how could it not be a good book? It said Dune, and I wanted to read this. And you notice this was a 1974 edition. And look at the name and the title already. It says Frank Herbert's Classic Dune. Already, this was like 10 years after it was, or 9 years after it was published. So, and again, sandworm monsters. So I read this book when I was 12 years old, and I read a different Dune than every other time that I read it. Because when I read it at 12 years old, this was the coolest, kick-ass science fiction adventure story ever. This young boy on a desert planet, and his parents get caught in a war, and his dad has a poisoned tooth, and he gets exiled in the desert. He has to survive and fight sandworms, and joins the Fremen tribe, and overthrows the evil galactic emperor and marries the princess, and that's a great book. I hope that wasn't spoilers for any of you guys. And then when I read Dune again when I was in college, it was a completely different book. How did I miss all this stuff? I'm reading this and I'm like, wait a second, there's politics in here, and economics, and religion, and I remember for the very first time, this line from the Baron struck me when the Harkonnens are taking over Arrakis again, and they're wiping out the Atreides, and he's calling in all the Spacing Guild and getting all of his military ships in. The Baron makes a comment that he's going to have to, don't quote me, I'll probably get this wrong, he's going to have to triple the spice production for the next 100 years to pay for this war. And I'm reading this in college going, what? Somebody has to pay for a war? Really? It never occurred to me that because all the stuff that I'm reading, you have big space battles, watching Star Wars, all this stuff. Nobody has to pay for this stuff, right? This was like a revelation to me, so I was reading the book, and then I've read Dune probably like 7 or 8 times, and each time I get a whole different perspective on it. But I will do some of the background stuff just so that you can get some framework on it. Frank Herbert was a newspaper reporter, and he published his very first novel in 1956. From Doubleday, it was called The Dragon in the Sea. It was a pretty cool book, and it was also very successful. So then Frank Herbert wrote more stuff, and he couldn't get them published. He wrote a novel called High Op, which was sort of a dystopian, edgy science fiction novel. Couldn't get it published. He wrote a book called Angel's Fall, which was a survival adventure in the Amazon jungles. Couldn't get that published. He wrote a Cold War thriller called A Game of Authors, which was an author disappears down in Mexico, and he's being held by communist rebels, and they're forcing him to write propaganda for them. That never got published. He wrote a mainstream book called A Thorn in the Bush about life in a little tiny Mexican town, and he couldn't get that published. And he was writing short stories and novellas, and Frank Herbert was a guy, he just didn't pay attention to what the market was. He wrote whatever he wanted to write. And it turned out whatever he wanted to write was kind of unmarketable. Finally, after 6 years, he couldn't get anything published, and his agent was getting frustrated, Frank was getting frustrated, so he wrote a book that was the most unpublishable book of all. He wrote Dune. And Dune, in the end, was 215,000 words long at a time when your average book was 75,000 words. He wrote this book that had huge ecological stuff, political stuff, complex plots, filled with strange words, not at all traditional stuff. Who on earth would publish this thing? But it was pretty good. His agent actually liked it, but nobody wanted to publish it. So Frank actually published the first part called Dune World in Analog magazine. It was serialized from December 1963 to February 1964. And he worked with the editor, John W. Campbell, who was a very, very famous science fiction editor. And they had lots of correspondence about developing this. Campbell didn't like the fact that Paul seemed to be like a Superman. He had all these powers, and Frank would be arguing about that he wanted him to have prescience, and all these are long letters. Some of them were published in Maker of Dune, which was a collection of essays, and a lot of these letters are here in the archives, which I've read a bunch of them. So he finally publishes this. He got a lot of attention for Dune World in Analog Magazine. And he wrote this book, though, that was 215,000 words long. And he had an option from Doubleday because they had published Dragon in the Sea and did very well for them. But Doubleday, I saw this letter, Doubleday said, this might be good, but we can't publish a 215,000 word book. That would be enormous. That would require us to put a $5 cover price on the hardcover. We can't possibly do that. Nobody would buy a hardcover for $5. So they turned it down, although they did offer that maybe if he cut the book down to 75,000 words, that it could be part of their line. Well, some of you may know, Brian and I found Frank had outlined a 75,000 word space adventure version of Dune. We wrote it. We wrote it up based on that early outline, and we called it Spice Planet, and it's in the book called The Road to Dune with a lot of other notes and stories. In all, Dune got 23 rejections. I remind you, this is the best-selling science fiction book of all time, and it got rejected 23 times. So what is the agent going to do? Because he's sticky with his client, but this client is like a ball and chain around his ankle. He can't sell anything. The guy won't write to a market. He won't write marketable stuff. What am I going to do? So he sends books around, and to this day, I can't figure out what was going through the agent's mind. The agent next, after 23 rejections, the agent sent the book Dune to Chilton Books. Chilton Books was a publisher of auto repair manuals. Why on earth would you send a 215,000 word science fiction book to a publisher of auto repair manuals? Well, it turns out that the editor, Sterling E. Lanier, was a big science fiction fanatic, so he actually read it, and he loved it. Now this, I can't verify this, but I've got some correspondence and some discussion, so this is rumor. I happen to believe it. Well, it turned out that Sterling Lanier at Chilton Books, there was a little friction there between the publisher and between the editor. And I think that they were kind of looking for an excuse to get rid of him. So they let him publish Dune, basically giving him enough rope to hang himself. Well, Dune turned out to be a big success, so that their plan to get rid of Sterling Lanier kind of backfired on them. But they had a successful book. They wanted to retitle it How to Repair Your Ornithopter to fit with their line. Dune came out, it won the Nebula Award in 1965, and it shared the Hugo Award in 1966 with Roger Zelazny's novel And Call Me Conrad. 1969, he published Dune Messiah, so he sent the sequel, Dune Messiah, to John W. Campbell, and John W. Campbell absolutely hated it. This is not the droids he was looking for. Instead of being this great adventure where Paul takes over the Imperium and he's marrying the princess and he's this big hero, Frank Herbert makes Paul Atreides into a total jerk. He's got the blood of billions on his hands. He's hated around the galaxy. It's a depressing ending. His wife dies in childbirth. He goes blind. He goes walking off into the desert and disappears at the end. This was not what John W. Campbell wanted for Analog Magazine, so he rejected it. Frank Herbert published the serialization in Galaxy Magazine, and then a few years later, 1976, he published Children of Dune. Children of Dune, which Children of Dune, published as a science fiction novel, became the very first science fiction novel to hit the New York Times bestseller list, ever. There have been other science fiction books that published it, but they weren't called science fiction. They were called thrillers or whatever. This one said science fiction on the spine, and it was a New York Times bestseller, the first ever. Now, I'm not going to go into all kinds of details because I promised you this wouldn't be a boring college lecture, even though we're in college. If you want all the details, I suggest that you read Brian Herbert's book, Dreamer of Dune. It is truly a fantastic biography. It's a very personal story about Brian growing up with his father, not getting along with him all that well, not understanding why his dad needed to lock himself in the study and do work. It's very detailed. It was nominated for the Hugo Award when it came out for Best Nonfiction or Best Related Work. I strongly suggest you read it if you're a Frank Herbert fan. But back to the more nostalgic thing like I promised you. This is when I came in, 1976, because I read Dune, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, and I remember my paperback of Children of Dune. That's where I was sitting in my high school auditorium, skipping out on gym class because I had hurt my knee, so I got a note from the doctor, so I didn't have to do dodgeball. But I was sitting in the bleachers while everybody else was having fun, and all I was doing was just reading. But I was sitting in the bleachers reading about young Leto covering his body with sand trout and racing across the desert and having superpowers, and I'm thinking, this is a whole lot more fun than dodgeball. Let's see. Okay, so I read Dune, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune. I wanted to be a writer. I went off to college. My parents would let me major in English because I wanted to be a writer, but they said, find something where you could get a job. So that's why I majored in astronomy and Russian history. But when I was in college, Frank Herbert came out with another Dune book, the next one, God Emperor of Dune. God Emperor of Dune was the very first hardcover novel I ever bought with my own money. It was, I think, $13, hardcover book, because I didn't want to wait an extra second to read the next Dune book. I did graduate with my astronomy and physics degree and my minor in Russian history. I got a job as a tech writer out at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which, for some ironic set of circumstances, I had exactly the credits they needed because I was a writer and I published some things. I had a degree in physics and astronomy, so I understood science, and I had a minor in Russian history, and this was during the Cold War, and the Nuclear Weapons Design Lab was worried about the Soviets, so they said I had this perfect combination of skills. They hired me as a technical writer, and so I moved out to California. I kept writing. I was working with scientists all day long, and I kept reading Frank Herbert stuff. Now, I'm just focusing on the Dune things here, but that wasn't enough for me. I read everything Frank Herbert wrote, not just The Dragon in the Sea, but I read The Green Brain and the Santaroga Barrier and Whipping Star and the Dasadi Experiment and The White Plague, and I'm not going to list them all for you, but I read everything Frank Herbert wrote. All of his short stories, all of his novels, everything. I kept reading, studying him because I learned a lot from Frank Herbert as a writer. I learned how he plotted, how he added all these little subtle details and built his worlds. I particularly loved Hellstrom's High. Then in 1984, Heretics of Dune came out, and I was delighted to see the story continue. It was obviously the start of another big arc of the story. The David Lynch movie came out in 1984, and man, was I excited. I saw the commercials for it. I saw Frank Herbert being interviewed on TV saying that David Lynch has captured the Dune in Frank's imagination. I went to see the movie Dune the very first day it showed in the theater. How many of you actually saw it in the theater when it was out? Okay, a lot of you might not know this, but it was considered so dense and so difficult that when you went to the theater, there was an usher standing there with a stack of paper, of printed forms, and they would tear it off and hand you a glossary cheat sheet for you to read before the movie started. I still have my copy folded up inside that orange copy of Dune I showed you before. It's this page that it's definitions of what the Bene Gesserit are, and what Muad'Dib means, and what the Harkonnens are, and what the Fremen are. It's pages, it's 2 pages, front and back, just listing the vocabulary that you were supposed to memorize before the movie started. And then, of course, the movie starts, and you have Princess Irulan up there, and she's explaining everything before the stuff starts, too. So there's a lot to get going in Dune. And this was at a time when, this was before most big science fiction movies came out, so people didn't think you knew all the terminology before it came out. They were explaining navigators and folding space and everything. Anyway, throughout all this stuff, I had sold some professional short stories to a magazine of fantasy and science fiction, to a bunch of anthologies. I got an agent. I became a full member of the Science Fiction Writers of America. And when you become a full member of the Science Fiction Writers of America, you get their membership directory. And the membership directory has Frank Herbert's home address in it. And that was when I saw his address there. And I was starting to write my novel, my first novel. And I decided that when I finished my novel and published it, I was going to send the very first signed copy of my novel to Frank Herbert, because he was such an influence on me. So I wrote the book, I was editing it, and I made up my mind I was going to do this. I had my agent who was going to be marketing it, and Frank Herbert died before I could get it published. So I was never able to actually send it to him, but, well, you know what these are. These are the other Frank Herbert ones. This is my first novel. Isn't that a beautiful cover? Giant stone skull with a rocket ship on it, people with pink jumpsuits. I don't care, it was my first novel and I loved it. So, but I couldn't deny the Frank Herbert influence on my work. Everything about the way I plot things, the way I develop my worlds, the way I set up my politics, that's all Frank Herbert's influence. And I knew it and I kept thinking about it. Resurrection Inc. was nominated for the Bram Stoker Award for Best First Novel. I published several other books that were all critically acclaimed, which in writing terms means that the reviewers liked it and nobody bought them. I got a movie option for one of my thrillers from Universal Studios. I wrote a whole bunch of Star Wars books. I had 20-some bestsellers. I kept writing. One of my novels, The Assemblers of Infinity, was nominated for the Nebula Award. I was getting built up pretty much in my career. But I kept thinking about Dune. Now, the way I write, I dictate when I've got a digital recorder and I walk around and I do mountain climbs and trails through the Sierras, and when I'm writing like something on an ice planet, I'll be out in the snowstorm in the mountains. And for some reason, I liked to go to Death Valley a lot. I would hike around the canyons a lot. I would go and spend weeks. I lived in the Bay Area at the time, so I would drive down and I would hike around. And I was writing a lot of Star Wars books. And Star Wars, you know, Tatooine was a lot of it was filmed in Death Valley. Jabba's palace is out in Death Valley. And that's where I was doing a lot of my writing. And I finished some scenes. I was out there for a trip. And I finished my chapters, and I'm like really into what I'm writing, and I'm dictating, doing my pages, doing everything, and I kind of missed a turnoff on the trail that I was supposed to do. I was doing this big canyon loop, which was supposed to be a 4-mile canyon loop, but because I missed the turnoff, I sort of accidentally did an 11-mile canyon loop. And so I finished writing what I was going to write a long time before I was back to the trailhead. And I kept walking along, and I was running out of water, and I'm surrounded by Death Valley and these tall, dry canyons, and walking, and buzzards are starting to circle over me. And I started to think about Dune for some reason. I don't know what the connection was there. And I read all the Dune books, and I kept thinking about, because Frank Herbert, at the end of Chapter House Dune, the last one that he wrote, it's a cliffhanger. Duncan Idaho and Shiana and the survivors are in the No ship. The outer Matres have destroyed the planet Dune. The last sandworm of all is inside the hold of the No ship, and they've flown off into nowhere. They didn't, no coordinates, they just fly off. The outer Matres are taking over the rest of the galaxy. It's a lot of bad stuff. It's kind of like ending it with Luke, I am your father. Different universe. And that's where Frank Herbert passed away, so the story was just ended. So as I'm in the middle of Death Valley thinking about Dune and thinking about this cliffhanger ending and going on and finally getting back to the trailhead, I kept thinking, all right, well, I've got like 50 books published. I've been nominated for almost every major award in the field, and I can write in other established universes as Star Wars and X-Files and everything has set up. And why on earth hasn't Brian Herbert finished this Dune story? I never met Brian, but every writer in the field sort of knows each other. This was 1995, and I kept thinking about Dune needing to be finished. It's not like, let's go back to the well and milk some extra money out of the Dune universe. It's clear that there was more to this story. Frank Herbert just stopped it at the end of Chapter House Dune, and it was clear that he was planning to do more. So I contacted Brian. I wrote him a letter. Now, Brian had written a bunch of his own novels. He was a critically acclaimed author, Sudana, and The Race for God, and all kinds of really good books that he had done. He had co-written Man of Two Worlds with Frank Herbert, which was the very last book that Frank Herbert wrote before he died. That was 30 years ago. And I thought, I'm going to contact Brian and just see what his plans are for Dune. So I sent him a letter that began with, what you just read is a shot in the dark. And I explained to him about not just my love for Dune, but for all of Frank Herbert's stuff, and wanting to know if he had plans to finish the story, and if we could talk about that, because I could help him. I was offering my assistance. So about 2 months went by, and I didn't hear anything back from him. And I have since learned that Brian then went off and contacted like 20 other writers. Then he sort of did a background security check on me. But I had bribed them all ahead of time, so I was clear. And finally, he called me up just out of the blue. And we started talking on the phone. My wife was in the room, and we started talking. And she looked up at me, and she said, later on, she just said, after about 30 seconds, you guys just started talking a completely different language. Because we were riffing off of little obscure references in the eyes of Heisenberg and the God Makers and Direct Descent and Soul Catcher and going on and on about Dune and little subtle things. And we talked for about 2 hours on the phone. And we really clicked, we really hit it off, that we both had the same sort of excitement for Dune, the same sort of interest. And he had, lots of people over the years, this was about 9 or 10 years after Frank Herbert had passed away. Lots of people had approached him saying, hey, let's do more Dune books. But he had always turned them down. And he was basically calling me up to turn me down. And we started talking so much that he kind of got excited. And we decided, well, let's talk about this some more and think about it. So I flew up to stay with him for about 5 days in his house in the Seattle area. And we just, like, nonstop, all day long, talking about all the other Dune books and unfinished things and plot threads and stuff. Now, I had asked him if there was notes or an outline for the last book that Frank Herbert wanted to write, and he said no. Frank Herbert never wrote with an outline, never wrote with any notes. That what he did remember was Frank, for the last year of his life, was going through all 5 of his Dune books with a highlighter, just highlighting a bunch of things, but it was all in his head. This was before Google and before, basically before computers, but it was before the internet, before anything. Frank Herbert had it all in his head and he knew what he wanted to do. So we were talking about, well, what should we do? And my original approach was I just wanted to write the grand finale, the Dune 7, because I wanted to know how it ended, even if we had to write it ourselves. I wanted to know how it ended. Now, in reality, well, this is not a typical audience because you're here for Dune, but I want a show of hands. How many of you have read Dune? Keep them up. Keep them up. How many of you have read through Children of Dune? Okay. How many of you have read all 6 of the books through Chapter House Dune? Okay, look around you there. Okay, what really happened was you can put your hands down now. I'm not going to play with you. I'm not the Baron. I'm not going to make you stand there and be tortured. What happened was everybody read Dune. And probably 2/3 of them read through Children of Dune. God Emperor of Dune was like a giant speed bump. A lot of people love God Emperor of Dune. They think it's their favorite one. But that book made people just sort of stop. It was weird. The Leto II is turning into a giant sandworm and spends about 300 pages complaining about how long he lived, and then you have this great, wonderful climactic ending. But God Emperor of Dune really lost a lot of readers. And the other ones, Heretics of Dune and Chapter House Dune, also they were selling maybe 1/3 of what the other ones were. And so we decided, this was 10 years after Frank Herbert had passed away, after Chapter House was published. And if we just jumped in and did, all right, here you go, here's the sequel to Chapter House Dune, that we would only hit that very that very particular audience who had read all of the other books. But we loved Dune. We wanted to have like more of a resurgence in Dune for people to read it again. And how do we get people more interested? Well, instead of just doing Dune 7, we thought we should do some prequels instead, just to get people reading the series once more. Now, Frank, before he passed away, and when Brian and Frank had written Man of Two Worlds, Frank had asked Brian to write some sequels with him, some more Dune books with him. And in fact, the thing that they had talked about was to do the story of the Butler and Jihad, way back at the origin of the Dune universe. That never happened. Frank, I think most of you know, Frank got pancreatic cancer. He died fairly quickly after his wife died within I did look this up, within probably 2 years, I think. We kept thinking about what should we do, and we decided that we would be doing the story of the previous generation. Young Duke Leto, his romance with Lady Jessica, his first battles with Baron Harkonnen, how Shaddam became emperor, how the planetologist Leah Kynes' father goes to Dune. So we just sat there and brainstormed. We worked on this all like 5 days, plotting out what would become House Atreides and House Harkonnen and House Karita. And I went back home and kind of slept for 2 days because my brain was just exhausted. We just talked about this for days and days. And as this really, really strange serendipity, again, remember, this was 10 years after Frank Herbert had passed away. Right after I went home, within that week, the estate attorney called up Brian and said, so it's been 10 years, we're closing out all the files and wrapping up the folders and boxing everything up, and what do you want us to do with this safe deposit box key we just found? And Brian said, what safe deposit box key? Well, Frank had left a safety deposit box in a bank in downtown Seattle, and it was actually so old when Brian and the lawyer went to it. It was so old that they had to drill out the locks because it was all corroded, didn't work anymore. And they opened up the safety deposit box, they pulled it out, and inside there was some jewelry, there was some correspondence and letters, there were some recipes that Frank Herbert had left. Yes, we still have, we'll do the Dune cookbook someday. Although we have to test them, and one of them is Frank Herbert's recipe for making homemade head cheese from the remains of a pig's head. So I'm not going to test that one. And there were 2 floppy disks, by which I mean like floppy disks, and a dot matrix printout that had the full write-up for Dune 7. This was the thing that Frank Herbert had actually written to send to the publisher saying this is what he wanted to do for the last book, which he called Dune 7. So that was kind of cool. Now we had our roadmap. Now we knew where we were going. We had been planning on it ahead of time, but now we knew where we were going. Now Frank, he published a lot of other books, and the Saudi Experiment, The White Plague, other ones were very successful, but I think a lot of you know that his wife Bev had cancer. And she was degenerating for a long time. And he was doing all kinds of medical treatment for her, and a lot of it wasn't covered. He was doing experimental treatments. She couldn't breathe and live in the Pacific Northwest, so he had to build a house for her in Seattle, in Hawaii. And the only way he could pay for this was by selling Dune books, because Dune was the only thing that would pay him large enough advances so that he could take care of his dying wife. And so he sold Dune 7 in order to get the advance so that he could take care of Bev. And then she died a couple of years before he did. So we read this proposal. We were plotting out our own house trilogy. We got all the outline done, and we wrote up this proposal. Now, ours wasn't just a short proposal like Frank's was for Dune 7, because we were trying to pitch new Dune books. We had to convince the publishers that we could actually deliver the right stuff, that this wasn't going to be Spice Planet, this was going to be a big, complicated Dune book. So we wrote up a proposal for the house trilogy. Our proposal was over 100 pages long, which is like the longest proposal that's ever been submitted to New York and actually read. And there were many publishers bidding on it. Lots of people were interested because Dune's the best-selling science fiction book of all time. And we got a lot of bids on it. Finally, we got an offer from Bantam Books, which we accepted, which was the largest single science fiction contract in publishing history. And so, we wrote our books. House Atreides came out, and it became a runaway bestseller. It sold 3 times as many copies as anybody expected it to, which is wonderful. It's delightful. Everybody said that sounds terrific. The problem is it sold so fast there weren't any copies to put back in the bookshelves. So that they were sold out instantly, and there's big slots empty on the bestseller list. You go to the racks in the airport where it's New York Times bestseller number 3. Well, there weren't any books to put on it. So then nobody bought the books the next week because there weren't any books to buy. So then we fell off the New York Times list again because we didn't sell very many because there weren't any to buy. And then they reprinted them and they got it back in there. Consequently, if you have a first edition hardcover of House Atreides, they're worth a fair amount. And if you have any lying around, I'd like some. Anyway, so we followed up with House Harkonnen, which was labeled a New York, well, House Atreides was the science fiction, SFX Magazine's Reader's Choice Award #1 winner. House Harkonnen was a New York Times notable book. We published these 3 books, and this wraps up, the end of House Carino ends with Paul Atreides being born. I know that's a spoiler, but you have to assume that he was born, okay? And then we decided what we wanted to do next. And so we were, I forgot the important part. We're writing the house books. We've got them all plotted. We're working on some details, and then, see, I've been a full-time writer for a long time. I have a big writing office in my house. Brian was writing a book every year or 2. He was running an insurance office. He was an insurance salesman. That was his thing. He would write on the side. Well, we sold this big Dune contract, so he could now actually become a full-time writer. And he had previously just been writing the little desk off the kitchen table. And he came out to visit me at my house in Colorado. And I have a big writing office. Well, if Brian's going to be my co-author, he, of course, needs a big writing office, too. And he had a house in the Seattle area that had a 3-car garage. And like most people that have a 3-car garage, you park cars in 2 of them and pile junk in the 3rd one. Well, the 3rd garage seemed like a perfect thing for him to remodel to make into his writing office, which meant they had to haul out all the junk that was in the 3rd garage, which the lawnmowers, and the bicycles, and the baby clothes, and the knickknacks. And as he's pulling all this stuff out, he's up in the attic, he finds a Xerox paper box stuck up in the rafters that Frank Herbert had put there before he died. And on the side of this Xerox box, in Frank Herbert's handwriting, it says, Dune Notes. And inside the box, there are over 3,000 pages of Frank Herbert's Dune Notes, including character biographies of Leto and Jessica and Reverend Mother Mohayim and the Baron and the Emperor, and all kinds of pages and pages of those little epigraph quotes that he put at the beginning of the chapters, ones that he had written but never used. There were chapters that he had written for Dune and Dune Messiah that he cut out, and so they were never published. There were alternate endings of Dune Messiah. There's one where this at the end of Dune Messiah, after Paul walks off into the desert blind, the mobs in Arrakeen just go so wild that they sweep into the fortress, and the mobs capture Princess Irulan and Reverend Mother Mohayim and literally tear them to pieces. That wasn't in the final book. In fact, if you read the book, The Road to Dune, we've got a lot of these alternate chapters that were in there. So this was neat. We suddenly had a lot of really cool stuff. There's other history about the Butler and Jihad, all these other things that we could be writing in. And so we put that into the house books. Then we decided next, because we knew what Dune 7 was going to be, and we wanted to build up more stuff, because there was a lot of things in the story for Dune 7 that required more background on the Butler and Jihad. So because Brian and Frank had talked about writing the story of the Butler and Jihad, that's the one that we wanted to do next. And I thought that was kind of really interesting, because this is 10,000 years before Dune. It's the origin of the Harkonnen-Atreides feud. It's how the Fremen come to to Arrakis, the first sand ride, the discovery of spice, all this really, really great stuff. So we were going to do that story. Now, Bantam Books had bought the House Trilogy. And one of the other publishers that I had worked with before was Tom Doherty at Tor Books. Tom's a really great guy, and he was a friend of mine because he had published a bunch of my books and we would meet regularly. But when we put our first proposal for these house books out and all these other publishers bid on it, Tom Doherty at Tor Books refused to bid on it. He said he wasn't interested because there's no way these guys can pull it off. He read House Atreides and he called up my agent and said, I was wrong, the next Dune books that come out, I'm going to buy them. Never really a good leveraging, negotiating point to tell an agent, but, and my agent said, well, you're welcome to bid. And he did bid for the Butler and Jihad books, and he outbid anybody else, and we have since been with Tom Doherty at Tor for all the rest of the books. And let's see. So those are the three Butler and Jihad books, the Machine Crusade and the Battle of Corinth. And then the Road to Dune up in the upper right-hand corner, that's sort of like the Silmarillion. That's some Dune short stories. It's the original, a whole bunch of the original notes that we found. It's some chapters that weren't published before in Dune. Some articles and proposals that Frank Herbert had written, some of the rejection slips, as well as that short novel Spice Planet I told you about before, sort of the Dune that might have been. That's all in there. Then finally, we got around to doing what was called Dune 7. But for those of you who read Heretics of Dune and Chapter House Dune, Frank liked to leave a whole bunch of the stuff on the cutting room floor. Like when the Otter Matres destroy the planet Dune, that's done between chapters. He doesn't show it. And Brian and I are more like, we like to show planets blowing up. I mean, that's fun. So the outline and all the events that happened in what Frank Herbert put for Dune 7, we fleshed them out, we expanded everything, and it actually broke up into 2 full-size books, Hunters of Dune and Sandworms of Dune. And then after we finished those, we went back. Now you remember that when Frank published Dune, and then he published Dune Messiah, there is I think a 15-year gap, 12-year gap, 15-year gap between the 2 books. At the end of Dune, Paul is this great hero. He's just overthrown the evil emperor, he's married the princess, he's going to make the whole galaxy run right. And then Dune Messiah opens up, and it's 15 years later, and he's a tyrant, and everybody hates him, and he's got the blood of billions on his hands. Well, how do you go from being that hero Paul to being the tyrant Paul? So we wrote Paul of Dune, which basically shows that trajectory. And then we did, after that, another one, we call them the interquels, that just sort of like fill in some of these really interesting gaps. The Winds of Dune opens up right after the end of Dune Messiah, where Jessica gets the news that Chani's dead, Paul has gone blind, and he has walked off into the desert, leaving the Empire with nobody there to run it. So she and Gurney have to go back to Arrakis and try to pick up the pieces. So that's where that one does. And what we're doing right now is going back after the Butlerian Jihad to talk about the formation of the great schools, the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood, the Mentat School, the Spacing Guild, the Navigators, the CSUF Doctors, the Swordmasters. So that's Sisterhood of Dune and Mentats of Dune. Those are the last ones that came out. And we are working on Navigators of Dune right now, the 7th draft, and I'm hoping to finish it and deliver it by tomorrow. I didn't contact any of my friends at all that I was going to be out here. I pulled up in my hotel room last night, edited 70 pages in it, killed off 2 main characters, so I'm feeling good this morning. Now, we released those books, all the ones I've showed you. Every single one of them every single one of the novels has been a New York Times bestseller. Those books have won or been nominated for numerous awards. Like I said, the New York Times notable book. The Butlerian Jihad was nominated for the Romance Writers of America Best Science Fiction Romance Novel, which we use that to remind our wives that, look, we can write great romance novels. Let's see, when ours came out, this is the other thing, because our books are not Frank Herbert's books. Our writing style is different. We decided at the very beginning that we weren't even going to try to copy Frank Herbert's style. This guy was a genius. He had so many ideas in his head. He had a very particular writing style. Brian was an established writer. I was an established writer. We wrote our own novels that are in the Dune universe. But what happened when we started publishing our Dune books is that the sales of the original Frank Herbert books tripled. By us bringing these new books out, everybody started thinking of Dune again. Everybody started wanting to read Dune again. They were reminded, wait, I haven't read that in a long time. I'm going to buy another copy and read it. Because of our new books and suddenly all the sales of the Frank Herbert books coming out and all the popularity, Sci-Fi Channel did a 6-hour new miniseries of Dune. And then they did a 4-hour miniseries called Children of Dune, which was basically Dune Messiah and Children of Dune. When we started out doing our stuff back in 1997 or 98, sorry, I should have looked all this stuff up, but when House of Atreides was published, when we published our book, every single one of Frank Herbert's other novels were out of print. The only thing of Frank Herbert's that was still available in bookstores was the Dune series, the 6 books. All of his other novels, The White Plague, The Saudi Experiment, Hellstrom's Hive, everything else was out of print. But because our books did so well, Tor Books has since reissued a bunch of Frank Herbert books. They've done The Saudi Experiment, Whipping Star, Dragon in the Sea, The Eyes of Heisenberg, The Sandaroga Barrier, The White Plague, Hellstrom's Hive, and just last fall, the one down at the bottom there, they released this massive hardcover of the collected short stories of Frank Herbert. Some of you might not know about that. If you're Frank Herbert fans, go check out the collected short stories of Frank Herbert. Those were the ones that they wanted to reissue. Well, I've got my own publishing house. And since Tor didn't want to reissue all of the books, I did. So my Wordfire Press has released, and this is in print copies and ebook copies, Direct Descent, The God Makers, The Heaven Makers, Soul Catcher, which is right now being developed as a film, Man of Two Worlds, and we are right now preparing and reissuing a new version of Man of Two Worlds for the 30th anniversary of that book. And Brian is writing a brand new introduction to it about how he wrote the book with Frank Herbert. So that one's coming out. We did Destination Void, and all of his Pandora books by Bill Ransom, The Jesus Incident, The Lazarus Effect, The Ascension Factor. And because we know people like nice little compact pocket books, we did the full omnibus of Pandora sequence, which is like a gigantic sized book. But remember those 4 unpublished books I was telling you about at the beginning that he wrote after Dragon in the Sea and before Dune? Well, we released those too. So you can get these never before published Frank Herbert novels. And these were finished. These weren't like notes that Brian and I wrote. These were finished, completed manuscripts of High Op, the science fiction dystopia one. Angels Fall, which is really a good jungle plane crash in the Amazon jungle, and the people are they're floating the wreckage of this plane down the Amazon River trying to get to port, and they run into all sorts of hazards. Game of Authors, very edgy Cold War thriller, and The Thorn in the Bush, which is sort of a mainstream set in a small town in Mexico. But not quite enough with that. We also are releasing a big volume ourselves, probably by Christmas or January, of all of Frank Herbert's unpublished short stories. All the ones that he wrote that had no market, the 30,000-word mysteries and the Wilfred, the country western singer that disappeared, and all these things that most of them aren't science fiction books or stories, but they're Frank Herbert. They're wonderfully written, they're interesting stuff. So that's coming out very soon. And just because you bothered to come out here on a Saturday when you could have been doing so many more interesting things, one of the things I want to show you is, I told you I'm finishing Navigators of Dune right now. I'm editing it, I'll turn it in. It's coming out probably next May, and so you get a sneak preview of what the cover looks like. And I think that's one of the coolest covers that Stephen Ewell did. So that's sort of my journey of 40 years with Dune. That's the last Dune book that we have under contract right now, and we're still talking. We've got lots of other ideas that we can be doing, but we just want to keep working in the Dune universe. Right now we're looking at, and I know somebody's going to ask, but the Dune film and TV rights have been tangled up for a fairly long time, and they're I think, finally getting cleared up. So one of the things we want to focus on is maybe try to go that route and see what happens. But I don't have anything to tell you on that, but I know somebody's going to ask, when are you making a Dune movie? We'll see. I hope so. So that's all I got to say. Do we have time for questions, Patricia? Yes. Does anybody have good questions or boring questions? All right, you got it.
Okay. The Paula Dune and then the Jessica
Winds of Dune.
I thought there was going to be another one in there.
We had talked about doing one called the Throne of Dune, which would be, well, actually, there were a couple of ones that we could do. There's still, after the Winds of Dune, there's still a big chunk before Children of Dune starts. So there's that whole part, which would be like Irulan's story and how she's in that and how everybody's trying to kill off the twins and all that stuff. But the one that we wanted to do was after Children of Dune, so like the first century or so of the Leto II Scott Emperor reign. And you think about it, here's this guy who basically, through whether violent means or through just time, everybody he knows is going to die. Every character in the Dune universe is not going to survive. Ganima's going to die, you know that she marries the prince and she's going to have kids and that's how the line's going to go on. But Ganima's going to die, Jessica's going to die, Gurney's going to die. Everybody's going to die, and the only connection he has with his life and his memories is Duncan. So that's how he's going to keep bringing Duncan back. That whole story of the first years of basically how the God Emperor goes from being this kid with sand trout on his skin to becoming this sort of embittered and ruthless God Emperor would be neat. And when I told my wife, this is a book where like everybody we know is going to die, and she said, that's a real cheery novel. Who wants to read that? So these are things that we could do, but they're not like a trilogy or any. We don't have to do them. They're just one-off books each time, and we'll see. I mean, the Navigators will be our 14th one, and we might want to take a year off or two. The Pumpkin Spice Festival. Yes, Steve.
You talked about yesterday about trying to mesh the two writing styles between you and Brian.
Mm-hmm.
And the way you've done it is like you take some chapters, he takes some chapters, and then you edit each other's chapters. How difficult is that with two mature writers to then have to try to mesh their chapters together?
Well, the way we do, I'll go up and I'll spend days with Brian. When we started Navigators what is it now? I think it was like last February or so. So I went up and spent several days with him, and we just spent days. We know what the book is going to be about, but we spend days doing it in detail, just brainstorming characters and scenes and outlining the chapters and building the blueprint of the whole book. So we spent 3 or 4 days just talking out scene by scene by scene, so that by the time I go home, we both have a pretty clear picture in our minds of what the book's going to be. But Brian has his areas of expertise and I have my areas of expertise, and we try to pick the chapters that play best to our strengths. And Brian's background is in philosophy and comparative religion, so he tends to do the more philosophical chapters. My background's in the physics and historical stuff, so I tend to write the chapters where things blow up. And I love saber and monsters and stuff, so that I do more of the action chapters, although Brian's pretty good at some of the action stuff too. He's particularly good with like the hand-to-hand fight scenes, the Otter Matre fighting and stuff. He does that. And after we've got the book outlined, then we'll flesh out the outline so that each chapter has like a paragraph description. This is what happens in the chapter. And we spend a lot of time so that we both agree on it because we don't want disconnects when we each write our chapters, because I need his chapter to fit with my chapter. He writes his chapters, I write my chapters, and yes, he writes half of them and I write half of them. I mean, it's within a one chapter variance, we each write exactly the same number of chapters. And then it depends on what order our schedule is, but he will send me all of his chapters, I'll assemble the whole book and I'll start through the thing from page 1 to the end. And we do it all online. I edit all of his chapters, I rewrite anything I want, I cut out any words I don't like, I add sentences to everything, so that anything that doesn't sound like me, anything that doesn't sound like Kevin when I'm reading it, I'll just kind of sand it down and get rid of it. And then I get all the way done, and I send that draft to Brian. And then Brian starts from page 1, and he goes all the way through and changes anything that doesn't sound like him. So he cleans it up, and then he sends it back to me, and I do the same thing again. I send it back to him, and he does the same thing. So right now we're on draft 7 of Navigators of Dune, and this is what goes off to the editor, and they'll probably make some comments. So we'll do probably one more iteration each, so that'll be probably 9, 10 drafts that we will go through. And by the time it's gone through that many iterations, it's pretty hard to tell who wrote which one. I mean, we've cleaned up our prose so that it's a unique synthesis, that it's not just sounding like me or just sounding like him. It's pretty much straightforward clone of Brian and Kevin.
Have
Yes.
you noticed any convergence in your styles over the length of this process?
Oh, I hope I've taught him how to be an excellent writer. Well, I mean, after having written 14 giant, I mean, they're all 700 pages long, they're giant books. I mean, I actually wasn't kidding. I've learned a lot from him because he already knew how to do some stuff that I didn't know how to do. And I hope that I've taught him some stuff to flesh out things and to do some world building and plotting that he didn't know how to do before. So I hope after working that hard together that we've each turned into better writers over the course of it. So I guess that's the right answer. Yeah, in the back.
You talked a lot about the marketing and the role of the agent. I'm curious what your thoughts are on book as a work of art and book as commodity and how that's changed over the last 40 years.
Well, 40, 50 years ago, right, like what Frank did, he wrote Dune, which was a totally unmarketable book. He spent an awful lot of time running away from paying his bills and living in destitute circumstances down in Mexico because he couldn't afford to live here in the US, and he had his family in tow. And Brian tells stories that they had this stovepipe hat around the house. And whenever Frank sold an article or a story, that little check would come in. And so it was a game in their family. They would put all of the overdue bills in the hat. And the kids would each pull a random bill out of the hat, and that's the one that got paid because he got a check. Not exactly what I would call the proper budgeting of family finances, but if you have a full-time job and you are supporting yourself otherwise, or if you have a spouse who happens to be independently wealthy or something, it would be wonderful to be able to write whatever you want to write and not care about it. And I'm very glad that Frank Herbert wrote Dune the way he wanted to and didn't cut it down to 75,000 words. But right now, if the publisher doesn't think that they can sell the book, they're not going to publish it. And authors today are very much expected to be half of the marketing team. I mean, you have to be out doing conventions and book signings and talks at Cal State Fullerton and all kinds of things in order to get people to know about your book and to be aware of it. If I've got in my mind 2 ideas for books, and one idea is about a Bosnian bicycle repair man who likes to write poems about his cats and flies kites, or if I want to write a story about a cloning dinosaurs and they make an amusement park out of it, my mind knows people are going to buy that one and nobody's going to care about the Bosnian bicycle repairman. So I will make the choice that if I'm going to spend my time, I'm going to spend my time on the one that people actually want to read. That is a choice that not all writers make. Some people just go, well, I want to write about the Bosnian poet. And sometimes that actually works. Sometimes people sell things. And there are books that catch on that to this day nobody can figure out why a bunch of people wanted to buy it. I am a novelist, I'm a storyteller, and the part of my job is to write stories that other people want to read. it's not a self-indulgent exercise to write something for me, it's writing something for an audience. It's like a musician, you're supposed to play what the audience wants. So I try to do things that other people want to read, but I don't want to do things that are work. I love telling stories. So I'm doing stories and books that are things that I want to create in an artistic sense, and I just happen to be very lucky that lots of people want to read them so that I can make them a commercial success as well. Does that answer your question, or did I just wander around?
Do you ever have the, want to do one just for you?
Yeah, I fortunately am successful enough that I can do things every once in a while that I just want to do that aren't like the other things that I did. One of the ones I did a couple of years ago is I'm known for these gigantic space operas, the Game of Thrones with planets, that kind of stuff, like the Dune stuff, like my Saga of Seven Sons. Well, I like to be funny too. I like to tell jokes, I like to make people laugh, but I can't do that because I write big, serious science fiction. If you read Dune, I defy you to find any humor whatsoever in that book. There is nothing funny in Dune at all. So I just carved out enough room in my writing schedule, and I wrote something I wanted to write. I wrote the very first novel in my Dan Shamble Zombie PI series. I loved it. I had a blast. I thought this was hilarious. I laughed out loud myself so much when I wrote it. The readers laugh out loud when they read it. They love it. I surprised my agent with it, saying, "Look what I did. This is wonderful. It's hilarious, and people are going to love it because when you're tired of The Walking Dead, you want to laugh. So this is like Spaceballs to Star Wars. And this is great." And my agent read it and said, "Yes, this is great, but Kevin Anderson can't write this stuff. He writes big science fiction." I said, "But I just wrote it. You just read it. But nobody wants to publish this because you, Kevin Anderson, you write big science fiction. You can't write humorous zombie books." So we actually went with a smaller publisher with it because my big publishers went, "But you can't write stuff that's funny." So I did that for me. The other one that I just did for me, in fact, it's my most recent book. It's called Clockwork Lives. It was written with Neil Peart, the drummer from Rush. And it's sort of a steampunk Canterbury Tales that I had no contract on it, no deadline. I just wanted to write it. He wanted to write it. We just did it. And it is, in my mind, the very best thing that I've ever written. And I just love it. The book came out and it looks utterly gorgeous. So I do stuff like that, but I also have my deadlines. I assume you want me to finish Navigators of Dune, okay? So that's a deadline. I need to get that finished and turn it in. But I'm lucky that I can do both. I'm lucky that I'm prolific enough that I can do both, because there are some writers that if you choose to do a book, that's a 3-year process. And if you make a mistake in what you choose for the next 3 years, your career's going to be in the tank if it bombs. So, I'm rambling again. Yes, Stephen?
You talk about Frank as if he's godlike in another entity. To some degree, you hold him in esteem. He's a hero of yours since your childhood.
Does anyone disagree? Okay.
Okay, so
Yes.
he's there, and you talk about Brian as your co-author of the rest of the work. I posit to you that now this is not just one book or the early books, it's now an entire series, and you are a third, easily, of that collected body of work. Have you ever taken a moment where you realized that you had written with Frank Herbert, you read his notes that no one else had seen, you got into his head, you worked with his son, his flesh, and you created this together, and now you are as much part of it, as many words as he has, assuredly. Have you ever acknowledged to yourself that it's Brian Herbert, Frank Herbert, and Kevin J. Anderson's Dune series? Has it ever, the gravity of that ever really sank into you?
If it ever does, my wife smacks me down.
I don't mean this hero worship. Have you ever been able to accept that responsibility and that you've given that back to people?
Well, okay, I will rein my head in here. I have also written 54 books based on Star Wars, and I've met with George Lucas, and I've worked at Skywalker Ranch and done a bunch of that. I have written the novel of the most recent Rush album. Rush has been my favorite rock group since I was in high school. I'm very close friends with the drummer who wrote every one of those songs and every one of those Rush albums. worked with the X-Files. I've met with this pin, the Superman pin that I have here, was given to me by the editor of Superman comics for so many years because I was working with them on a project, and I've written the story, The Last Days of Krypton, the whole story of how Krypton was destroyed and Kal-El was saved. And yeah, there are times when I sit back, I've produced 2 rock CDs, and the people who perform on them are the lead singer from Dream Theater, the lead singer from Kansas, the guy that sang Carry On Wayward Son, sings on my album. And there are times I sit back and go, yeah, if I had told myself this when I was 12 years old, I wouldn't have believed any of it. So, yeah, I mean, there are times when I stop back and I just go, I've got the coolest job in the world, and I don't ever want to disappoint people. I mean, I want to deliver what I promise, and I want to give them something that I'm a fan first and foremost, okay? And it's not just like, okay, I can write a Dune book just like I could write a respirator safety manual. It's my assignment for this week, and this is what I'm doing. This is something I'm passionate about from day one. From the very beginning, I approached this because I so badly wanted to be working on this. And just getting to come here to the archives collection, I spent a couple of days here going through all the boxes and the notes and the letters and reading some of this stuff, and I found, you know, there was a letter that I found from a young woman, a fan letter to Frank Herbert after Dune World was published in Analog. A fan letter, Dear Mr. Herbert, I really love your book. I enjoy all the story that you did. Signed, Anne McCaffrey, before she ever had anything published. I found, and it still gives me chills, in one of the boxes I found a square piece of notepaper, probably like from a telephone notepad or something, in the boxes, this is all kinds of miscellaneous stuff thrown in there. Found in the box was clearly something that was like on Frank Herbert's bedside table that he got up and just scribbled it down. On this piece of paper, in Frank Herbert's handwriting, I'm, as far as I know, I'm the first one who even found this as I'm digging through all these things. And I'm pulling it out, and on this piece of paper, it's written, damn the spice, save the men, dash, the key to Leto's character. And I pulled that out, and I just went, holy crap. This is like the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is like the coolest thing ever. Because this is the key to Dune. I mean, this is like the most important seed. And I just love finding that and just like backing out to see the thought process, like you said, like this is the part where Frank Herbert went, ooh, this is how I do this. And watching how he like reading the drafts of stuff, watching how he would put stories together and how he would decide, no, I don't need this or I need to expand that. And it's easier to do with these ancient manuscripts because Frank Herbert had to type them on onion skin paper with carbon copies. So unlike looking at a computer file, every one of these pages has things X'd out and arrows moving things around, so you get to see the sausage making. You get to see how Frank Herbert, why he moved this paragraph here, or an entire scene that he just X'd out, or something that he would expand on. You can actually see how he did all this stuff. And it was like wonderful instruction for me to be sitting there as his Padawan long distance, just reading all this stuff. So yeah, I get enthusiastic about it. I don't know what time we are. Okay. Anybody else?
Well, let's
Yes.
think.
Oh,
sorry,
go
go
ahead. Yes.
So you've written a lot of books. How do you? Okay, this is me on deadline. How do you survive? How do you meet deadlines? How do you write so many novels? Because I have a 2-week deadline. I have 60,000 more words, and I don't know if I can do it.
Then what the heck are you doing here? I'm very glad you came. Thank you. I like to write. I actually prefer to write over almost anything else. There are other people who hate to write, and they just approach it like a job, like they're a plumber. They just hate it. To me, I'm like, if I'm doing anything else, the back of my brain is usually going, you could be writing right now. You could be writing right now. I love hiking. I love mountain climbing. But I get to write while I'm doing that because I have my recorder. I flew in yesterday morning. I drove here and I gave my talk at 1 o'clock yesterday afternoon. I have lots of friends in the LA area, lots of people who want to go out to dinner, want to do something. You guys wanted to go out to dinner. And I told everybody, no, I'm going to hole up in my hotel room and just edit because I've got Navigators of Dune to finish up. And I am traveling so much, I'm doing so many conventions, and last weekend was Salt Lake Comic Con, and then I'm here at this thing. I need to just carve out the time. I have noise canceling headphones when I'm on the airplane. I can probably get 30 pages edited on the airplane. I do not mind if we have to circle for 45 minutes before landing. I write all the time. I've got a bunch of different projects going. And my entire life and my entire time is one deadline after another. And I honestly do get a little bit frantic because I've got my deadlines, right? Navigators of Dune, I'm doing at the same, that one's 600 pages long. And I have the third book in my saga of shadows called Eternity's Mind, which is 700 pages long. And I'm editing both of them at the same time because I'll finish Navigators, send it off to Brian, and then jump into my Seven Sons book and be working on that. But Brian, because the deadline's coming up, Brian turned the Navigators draft 6 around so fast, he sent it to me before I finished Eternity's Mind, so I basically stopped that one, did my draft 7 of Navigators, which I will probably finish tomorrow and send it in. Then I will immediately go back to finishing the other 400 pages editing Eternity's Mind, and then, well, that was the first draft, so then I go back to page 1 again, go through it again, page 1 again, go through it again. Well, I'm also outlining whatever my next thing is going to be that I'm going to be writing. I've sold a book to Bain Books that I'm writing with Peter Wax. You've met Peter.
Yeah.
Sort of an alternate fantasy America, and it's called Uncharted, Lewis and Clark in the Arcane Territory. So it's Lewis and Clark go through a magical America where there's dragons and monsters and everything trying to find the West Coast, and when they get to the West Coast, it's actually the edge of the world and the water falls off. So I'm going to be shifting from this gigantic space opera and Navigators of Dune to Lewis and Clark with dragons going to the edge of the world. I've got multiple personality disorder, I think, that's all. I like to write, I'm sorry. I mean, really, if I have a few minutes, I will get my laptop and I'll open up and I'll edit 3 paragraphs if that's all I have. My wife, who is also a best-selling writer, who's published 40-some novels, she doesn't like to write. For her, it's like going to the dentist. She likes to have written. She likes to be done with it and go, oh, this is what I wrote, this is great. But she does not like the process of sitting there and actually writing. So when we've got 10 minutes, I'm editing 3 paragraphs, she's playing Candy Crush. And if I'm playing, I mean, I have Angry Birds on my phone that's going, I could be writing right now instead of killing off birds and pigs. I think I'm more productive. Yes, sir.
How do you keep you have these massive universes, incredibly complicated characters, plot lines, blah, 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 all going at the same time, and then be able to, I guess keep them in your head to be able to jump from this to that to the other, as well as, moving forward. You have with these massive amounts of stories, it would seem like tough to be able to maintain focus on each one of them to keep them moving forward. How do you do that?
I have an enormous brain. Or multiple personalities, like I said.
Are you ever, editing Saga and realize that you've got a Navigator in there?
Well, that's kind of a joke, but it's not really, because the thing is that each of these universes have their own terminology. And that's the hard part. Like, okay, I'm in Seven Sons, and I'm in Dune. Now, Dune has plasteel, while other ones have plaz, and other ones have, they're like words for, science fiction words for common things. Does this universe use comlink, comline, communicator? If you get the wrong one, you're in the wrong universe. But you have to remember which terminology that you use, and that is hard. But that's what, like, editing is for.
So let me then follow up on that. So you do detailed outlines before you start into the,
Very detailed.
so
Which,
you need
you know, if I'm writing with Brian, you know, you can't have a collaboration if both of you are following the same blueprint.
you know,
I mean, you both have to know which stuff that you want to be writing. But even on my own stuff, I outline it very carefully because I've got 34 characters and they all have to be choreographed and all the plot lines have to go where they're supposed to be. And I hate to rewrite, as in I hate to, like, I've written 50 pages, but it's not working, so I throw it away and I write something else. I want to know what I'm going to be doing first. So, and I'm looking forward, my flight is at 6 p.m. tonight. I'm going, good, I've got hours I can sit there with my laptop and edit some more pages. So, anyway, thank you very much for coming out. We have a book signing out.